Last week, excuse me, I think it was last week, we had Autumn Pelche. It's a very young Indigenous woman. As a teenager, she spoke to the United Nations about the importance of water, and so she was on campus talking, and I unfortunately missed it. I keep looking back for this thing. So human rights, I just want to mention that from the United Nations perspective, water is a human right, but in Canada it isn't. We do not have any federal legislation here that protects humans' right to water. Interestingly enough, Quebec is the only province that has actually enshrined water in their legislation. We haven't learned anything from COVID-19, because certainly that exposed the problem with water, especially in First Nation communities, especially for people who live in impoverished conditions. If you can't wash your hands, how do you stop a virus, right? So really simple things. We need to make serious changes, and we need to call our governments to attention. So I'm going to talk about UNDRIP real quick. UNDRIP is the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. Why would Indigenous peoples need their own separate legislation if we're all human beings? So what's going on here? Well, I don't really have an answer for that other than here in Canada, status Indians are not considered human beings. Indigenous people are, but status Indians are not. We are considered wards of the crown. We are, the government and the crown feel that they need to care for their little red children here in North America, that we are not smart enough to make our own decisions or to control our own monies. So with UNDRIP, this is an attempt at the United Nations to try to get colonial governments to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples as human beings. So we have a lot of work to do, but it's the other part of that is that, and this might be unfamiliar language to young people, but when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, it's often said that we live in fourth world conditions. And so what we're referring to is that Indigenous peoples are living in first world countries, but in third world conditions. So we don't have access to water. We live in crap housing. There's no infrastructure to even build businesses in our communities. We've essentially just been pushed aside and forgotten. But it isn't just in Canada. These same issues exist for countries like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway. And it's these same countries that consistently vote down the human rights, recognizing human rights for other nations. They failed to, we're gonna hear about it after, but I talked about in my class how I warned my students that we would expect that the Canadian government would not support Palestine because this is a settler country. They can't. If they supported Palestine, they would then have to address the injustices and the oppression of Indigenous peoples here in this country. So it couldn't happen. And my students were, when it came out that that's where Canada and the United States were headed, I saw a lot of disappointed faces in my class. They really hoped that I was wrong about it. Okay, so First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities in Canada, when we say Indigenous, that's who we're talking about. And I want to make sure that that's clear for people. We're talking about the First Nation, the Métis, and the Inuit people. The reason I'm saying that is because when we make policies and legislation, or we set up initiatives or programs in this country, and we've earmarked funds for Indigenous people, we're talking about the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. They are the poorest 5% in this country. And that's why we make all of these changes. We try to introduce different policies. We try different programs out to try to address this, the fact that the poorest people in this country are the Indigenous people. So like I said about the Indian Act, that it removes First Nations people's rights, that allows the government to control the land. It controls the Indian Trust Fund, which is, last time I looked at it was about 8 years ago, and it sat at $3.2 trillion. The United Nations has told Canada to hand that money over to the Indigenous people, and Canada still refuses to do so. The United Nations has also told Canada to hand over the documents that say they have the rights to this land, that they own this land, and Canada has failed to turn those documents over as well. That's going on 10 years. That was our Conservative government who got ordered to do that, way before we had the Liberals in there. So the Liberals haven't addressed those issues either since they've been in government. Okay, so I've talked about water, I've talked a bit about policy, about terminology, about the different laws that exist for different people in this country. But I want to get onto an issue that really affects all of us right now, and that's the legacy of the nuclear waste that's right here in our backyard. In my territory, in the 1950s, the government decided to build a nuclear facility called the Bruce Power nuclear site. Here, they produce power for everybody in Southern Ontario, but they also produce power for the United States. Whether the United States buys it or not, we're still making it for them. They often don't buy it, and we put the power back. We just shoot in the ground. You just stick a cable in the ground and shoot it in. So we're wasting power. We're making more power than we actually need, and more power than we can actually use. Okay, so this has been going on since the 1950s. When it was built, my community was never consulted. No one ever came to set up any kind of monitoring of human health. There's no monitoring of the water. And in fact, they just started to realize in the last couple of years that they weren't even monitoring the water around their nuclear facility properly because they didn't understand how the currents worked in the lake. They were only monitoring the surface water and had no idea about how the water was moving underneath. So they've started to try to collect that data now. So the issue for my community being a fishing community, it all has to do with how these nuclear facilities operate. What these facilities do is they have to suck in cold water so they can cool down these reactors. And they hold the water as long as they can, and then eventually they just have to let it go back in the lake. Because they're using so much water, they can't hold the water to allow it to cool down enough. So since 1950, they've been releasing warm water back into Lake Huron, slowly warming up the lake. In the last 25 years, Bruce Power has come again to my community. This time they wanted to extend the intake pipes further out into the lake so they could draw colder water in. The lake is getting it's too warm. So when they were asking my community about this, we have, at that time, had a biologist working with us, and the biologist said, absolutely not, you need to stop this. We're a fishing community, I'm gonna keep saying it. We survive on fish. This nuclear facility has warmed up the lake, so it's devastated and ruptured how the fish spawn in the spring. They usually come up into our river, spawn in the river, and then the fish go, once they grow a bit, they go back into the lake. But the water's too warm and the fish aren't spawning. The other thing that we've realized is these intake pipes, they cross the migrating path of the whitefish. So the fish will spend the winter in the southern part of the lake, and in the north, they come up to the northern part of the lake. The fish are no longer traveling. It's affected, their ability to reproduce, and now we have no fish left in our lake. My people have nothing to eat. So we're forced to eat processed foods, to rely on government handouts, and this has drastically reduced the health of the population. The other thing we don't have is any health services. So while all of this crap is going on, people don't have anywhere to go to the doctor. We don't have access to medications, and we certainly don't have any access to any kind of cancer care. So it's got devastating effects in our community. And so where Canada is at right now is they're proposing. So right now, all of the nuclear waste, the spent rods, the chairs that people sit on, the brooms they use, the lab coats they wear, all of that collects that nuclear, collects radiation and other stuff. And I'm not a scientist, just want to put that out there. I'm public health, I'm an anthropologist, I just look at human stuff. So anyway, you scientists can all dig this stuff up and get more in depth and learn more about this. So right now the waste is sitting on top of the land. And it wasn't a big deal until we had 9/11. And then the government started telling us, well, there's this terrorism that's happening, and they might come over here and blow up the nuclear site, and we have all this nuclear waste sitting on the land. We need to do something about it. That was the start of this conversation. Now we've moved past that, right? People have forgotten that. Now we're on to COVID. Oh, we forgot about COVID. Now we're on to something else. So this deep geological nuclear repository is what's planned for our backyard. This town called Tiverton. It's about less than an hour away from Kitchener-Waterloo. And so what they're planning to do is to build this really deep repository underneath Lake Huron. And when they show us maps, they show us a picture of the CN Tower, and they tell us they're going to dig below the CN Tower. That's how deep this repository is going to be. It's going into limestone. It's going to be super safe. We're going to stick all of the low-level nuclear waste down there, and everything will be hunky-dory. We can build parks on top. We'll put up some fence. It's going to go great. So they came to my community because of this. The government wants consultation with Indigenous peoples. If there's going to be anything happening in our territories, the government's telling businesses and themselves they need to consult with First Peoples. So they came out and did a vote. We voted in 2020 whether or not we would accept this nuclear waste site and whether we would allow low-level nuclear waste to be buried there. Double the amount of people that vote in our usual elections, like double the amount of people came out and voted, and we all said, hell no, you are not putting that stuff under Lake Huron. We're not going to poison the drinking water of everybody in Southern Ontario. That is not happening. They left, they went away, and now they're coming back again. They want to do a second vote. This time they want to know if my people will approve high-level waste underneath Lake Huron. As if we're going to say yes to that now, right? But they're coming again. And I just want to let you know that in the fall of 2024, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization will decide where they're going to put this dump. It's either here in Tiverton, or they're going to put it up in St. Agnes, which is up in the North Shore, still under Lake Huron, still going to affect all of our drinking water. But if we don't get involved now and start having a say and start bringing attention to this, it's going to pass, and it's going to devastate everybody, all of the life forms that live here, and including those beings that my people swore to protect forever and ever, for everyone's benefit. So they're putting us in a horrible position. And my colleague here I said to him, I really wanted to show some pictures. And he said, oh, but words are more important. But I really wanted to show the scientists in the room this slide. And I want you to, if you get a chance, Google it up. It's the global temperatures of the world over time, the last 100 years. And you'll see in 1950, stuff starts to change. And so I asked my colleagues in public health, what on earth was going on in the world in 1950? What was something happened? What changed? Nuclear power. That's when nuclear power was introduced globally, and we started building these nuclear sites. And now we've got our oceans are overheating, our water is overheating. And so we do need data. We need to show these images. And so I'm sorry I'm against you on that one, but agree with everything else with you. This is, it's looking at these maps, these data points, these data sets. And I'm like, oh my God, it's staring us right in the face. That's what we need to change. So we could decommission these nuclear plants. It'll take 30 years to decommission. During that time, we could build a new grid. Think about new ways of creating power. Each of our homes could create power. And when we make too much power for our own home to use, we could sell it to the grid. And if we don't make enough power in our homes, then we can purchase from the grid. Right? There's different ways we can think about operating in this world without relying on these big monstrosity. They're huge, the things they built. The wind turbines are huge, and the damage they do to the soil underneath. These ramifications are incredible. So we just had World Water Day, March 22. If you care about, well, now you're going to care about the water after I said all of this stuff. And so I hope next year maybe we can all work together and do something here on campus to acknowledge the water, but maybe we should be doing something sooner. And you can. If you go to the House of Commons website, you can sign e-petition. It's E4852. And that's a petition to stop this nuclear waste site here in our territory, because it's going to affect every single one of us. So please sign the petition, get involved, and if you want any kind of organizations to get in touch with, I'm happy to share that info with you. So thanks for listening to me today. Miigwech.
Thank you. All right, I would say thank you to Dr. Buchan, and just to let you guys know, at the end of all our speakers, we will have a Q&A session where you can ask our speakers questions. So without further ado, our next speaker is Professor Omar Rahman.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Really honored to be here. And I learned a lot. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. You sensitized us to something that you know, I shouldn't say I'm ashamed, but I didn't know about, you know. So, and also I'm really, you know, just want to say one word. There's a lot of members I can tell from the Sikh community. I was privileged to visit the Golden Temple in India. And I had a wonderful experience there, actually, very, very moving experience. So again, that was my introduction to the Sikh people, because I interacted with them in a different way than just seeing them from a distance. I want to, you know, I have 20 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay, 20 minutes. I'll try to be on time. And you know, there's so much in common because they would. I lived in the U.S. many years of my life, and they would not dump waste in a privileged neighborhood.
That's right.
So it's not the issue of you guys are progressing you know, hampering the progress of civilization, right?
Yeah.
It is selective dumping. You know, they won't dump it in a privileged area. This is actually the story of the greed, right? The story of greed and genocide interwoven together, and it's really hard to separate. There's a lot that I can share with you, but I have 20 minutes, okay? So when we were talking about the power of words, I believe that all scripts, all godly revelations that came to us were in words. There were no images. That's why I believe words are very powerful, okay? It makes us think more. But let me give an introduction about myself, a relevant introduction. I'm a son of a Nakba survivor. What does Nakba? Nakba is an Arabic word, but it translates into the first Palestinian genocide. Maybe you haven't heard these coined together. But if you look at the definition recently, I've been parsing the definition very carefully, exactly what happened to the Palestinians in 1947-48, which started way back before that, fits the definition of a genocide. So I hope today that I will sensitize you to a few things. That's all. I've been sensitized to what you've said. This is what we can accomplish, you know, to sensitize us, and the human inside of us hopefully will be awakened, including myself. You know, what else can we do, right? So I'm a son of a Nakba survivor, and I've been living in diaspora practically all my life. Okay, in diaspora. And the diaspora is still diaspora, whether I have different passports or not. Diaspora is diaspora because it means that your core culture has been decimated, okay? So you're just drifting like a ship with like the ship that hit the Key Bridge, right? Yesterday, you're just drifting. Hopefully you don't create that damage, but you're just drifting, okay? Without strong something that you can go back to, the power of the place. So today is when I was told to talk about confronting the politics of genocide, so many things come to mind. Confronting the politics of genocide. So the first thing that I came to my mind, what should I say today that can lead to something substantive, right? Information, today we have access to information. Only the blind in their heart, not in their vision, choose not to see the right information today. There's no excuse, absolutely. So, so we're talking about, I'm not going to display in front of you what has happened, the worst atrocities of the last, since World War II, that happened to an ethnic group that happened in Gaza in the last 5 months. I'm not going to list these atrocities, okay? I'm not going to talk about the 1,000 plus amputees who lost their limbs. I'm not going to talk about the 25,000 kids and children that were blown to pieces. You know, you wouldn't even kill a duck like that. If you were to kill a duck in Canada like that, I think you will be jailed. I think that will be abuse, right? And so we're not talking about, I'm not going to list to you the 70,000+ people who have been maimed, have injuries that will last a lifetime, or that have trauma that is much worse, because I talk to people with trauma, it's much worse than physical injury. They say, oh, I wish, I heard it from some people, I wish I have cancer. Imagine cancer. I wish I have cancer rather than living with this trauma. This is all happening in front of our own eyes in this time, in this century, with this so-called progress and civilization, okay? I'm not going to mention that. You can Google it, right? But if you want, I'll save you the hassle of Googling left and right, because today's world is fully, in my opinion, controlled through the media. The media is channeling the information that we're getting. So I went to Google yesterday and I wanted to know how many were killed. Okay, how many, I'm sorry, not Google, how many were killed in Gaza since October 7th? You know what came back with 6,000? That's the first answer. So all the information that it came back to give me were outdated. Interesting. Is this a coincidence or not? Is there censorship or not? Well, it had been proven lately that Meta, Instagram, and X, and the corporate media have been deliberately manipulating information to minimize the atrocities that Israel is doing in Palestine. There are strong cases, undeniable strong facts to show that it had been manipulated. I wrote an article. I'll come to that in a second. In the right context. But I have to hurry. We have a genocide convention. I'm not going to read it. It will take some of my time. Everybody knows the UN Genocide Convention. It was put there for a reason. It was not just, of course, the UN does a lot of silly things, but this is one of the important things they've done, okay? So we can all read this genocide definition, which was established in 1948, declared. The question, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm intrigued by the reality versus illusion. We live today, the young people should pay careful attention to this. We live in two worlds. One world is the reality, like you're in front of me, that's reality. The other world is illusion, okay? And many of us believe in illusion, okay? Not reality. Now, how do we believe in illusion? Because what we perceive as reality depends on the information we get, right? The information, that's how we construct a reality, okay? So where am I going to? I'm going to straightforward to the CNNization, I call it, of the media around the world. Whether you are in downtown Kitchener or in downtown Delhi, guess what? You see CNN dumping agenda-driven information, okay? They sanitize things very well, extremely well. Other information is nowhere to be found. I wrote an article, and let me mention it. There's someone, I don't know if you know Stuart Seldowitz. Does that ring a bell? Stuart Seldowitz? Well, he is the one who was taunting and harassing the vendor in New York City. He's telling him that more Palestinians should be killed, right? It's a very interesting case. Search it, see what you can find. I mean, he's a racist bigot who was threatening a poor Egyptian vendor in the streets of New York with torture. He said, "We will torture you, we will pluck your nails." Because that man, Stuart Soldowitz, worked in the State Department at a time when the US was sending people to be tortured around the world. So he knew what he was saying. Nevertheless, we're not talking about Soldowitz today for that reason. I wrote an article to make this issue permanent. I wrote it, it was published by Counterpunch. Guess what? I tried to search the article later on. It was nowhere to be found. The first few days, it was there. I contacted the editor-in-chief of Counterpunch. I suggest that you check it out, a wonderful publication. He said Google took them out of their search engine. Isn't that interesting? It's just Counterpunch because it's an alternative media. They were taken out of the search engine. So look at the power of these search engines, because they're the ones who really shape the reality that we have nowadays. This is very frightening, in my opinion. Michelle Salzman, does that ring a bell? Michelle Salzman? Because it was erased from our history. She's a Florida State Congresswoman who wanted more Palestinians to be butchered. I mean, she was calling for genocide. This was way back, 4 months ago. Guess what? Not a single US paper picked up that story. You see, where am I going with this? I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. There's two worlds that we're living, reality versus this illusion. And this is the power of the media, which is creating this new reality, fake reality, pseudo-reality. Actually, it is an illusion. Okay, so when we talk about politics of genocide, what is politics? I love definitions. I love words. Words mean concepts, right? Before we go further, what is genocide? Well, we talked about genocide. What is politics? Okay. Is politics just disjointed from power? Impossible, right? I mean, what is politics? Eventually, everything has to come down to something, in my opinion, tangible. When you talk about Canadian government, at the end of the day, it's fish, right? Mm-hmm. It's feeding yourself, right? It's washing yourself, isn't it? It's tangible. That doesn't mean I'm talking about the whole world is materialistic. No, we're made of material. We need material. Eventually, it boils down to that. Can the powerful maintain power without controlling perception? Impossible. Those old days are gone. You know, when India went and colonized the world and butchered everyone around the world, right? From the Sudan to India, right? Those days are gone. Nobody likes to see blood anymore. It's not good, right? It disturbs the crown, huh? Mm-hmm. It disturbs the queen. It disturbs the king. You know, civility, right? So we have other ways to do the control, other ways to keep people subjugated. Remember waterboarding, when the US were doing waterboarding as torture? No blood, right? But you torture the person. Okay, so now what the evolution of genocide? I want to say a few words about the evolution of genocide. We can talk about details if you wish later on, question answer. But how do we prepare a culture for genocide? Okay? How do we make it okay? Because, by the way, genocide sounds like pesticide, doesn't it? You know, you use pesticides, right, to kill a lot of what? A lot of things, right? Mass scale killing. So how do people get to the point, whether they were Nazis or whether they were, by the way, the Nazis, of course, lost the war, or they were subjects of the UK, the United Kingdom, Great Britain. I mean, they were genocidal, were not there, right? They were genocidal, absolutely. You know, if we learn what Churchill said about the Arabs of Iraq, it's more than genocide, right? What Churchill and the UK did in the Sudan, in Bangladesh, in India, and so forth. So how do people like you and I all of a sudden evolve to become genocidal? Okay, this is something, I'm not a sociologist, I wish I was. It's wonderful. But they don't make much money, sociologists. How do we evolve to sanction these genocidal acts? We're seeing them in front of our own eyes. You know, when I hear about, I was recently in West Bengal just about 2 months ago, very close to what is today's Bangladesh, but it was the same before. I read about how the British chopped the fingers of weavers so that they don't make woolen items anymore. Chomsky, in his great book, 501, the book is entitled 501. It's a must read, okay? He documented how the British chopped the fingers of Bengali weavers, right? How do people get to that point? How do Israeli soldiers go and blow up innocent civilians, knowingly that they're innocent, just walking, as the images that we saw in the last 5 days? I don't know if you have seen those images. Anyone would like to see them? I have a full video of those images where they were hunting civilians who were running from war. Okay, how can the Israeli soldiers hunt a woman and her child, knowingly that they have no weapons and they're escaping? We need to reflect on that, because you know what's at stake is our humanity is at stake. How do BJP extremists, you know, justify, okay, or sanction statements that would say, well, if the Muslims increase beyond 30% threshold, it's dangerous. It's very dangerous in India. We should do something about it. I mean, these are not fringe BJP members. These are really big BJP shakers and movers. Okay, when Israeli politicians, not fringe politicians, hardcore in the government, would say that we should nuke the Gazans, not bury waste in Gaza. No, we should nuke the Gazans. And the world is silent, completely silent, yet people go to the Hamas charter, which quotes verses the Israelis interpreted as killing all Jews, which is completely bogus claim. Of course, we're not here to debate the Hamas versus all that stuff. Ideas, here's in the last 5 minutes, right? I have 5 minutes. Ideas that remain unchallenged, mostly enshrined in superiority or dogma, packaged as religious philosophy, etc. That's the beginning. 2, superiority rhetoric that is protected by the state. I gave you the example in India. And I'm not picking on India or Hindus. I can tell you that some Muslims do it. Absolutely. When Saudi Arabia was sanctioning killing the infidels, right, in Syria and Iraq. So it's not, don't get me wrong, it's not a religious thing, it's a people thing, okay? I do respect all religions without any discrimination. 3, inclusion through inculcation, through education and religion-based schooling, education. We have it in Israel, where Palestinians are dehumanized all the time, using fake biblical stories. Using religious site, this is critical, using religious site as an expansionist medium across all religions. The joke is that recently the UAE allowed the temple to be built in Abu Dhabi. I'm not against that, you know. But, you know, I'm just thinking maybe 400 years after that, today, India would say, oh, we have a claim in Abu Dhabi. Who knows, right? And again, across the border, Muslims do it, Christians do it, right? The first crusade was, these are our holy sites in the Middle East. Using sinister man-made religion as means to dehumanize the others, and then fabricating the trigger, the excuse, or the pretext for expulsion. Very structured science. Okay, in 2 minutes, what can we do in Canada? Because this is important, okay? We need to leave with an action, and I'll read it quickly because of time. Regarding Canada, Canada history should make us more sensitive. You know, those land acknowledgements, I said it repeatedly, I'm on the faculty, I was on the faculty equity committee, I said they are vacuous. To me, they're useless. They make mockery. If this is their land, give it to them, okay? If there's a genocide happening right now, admit it. Otherwise, you are really don't mean what you say. The right to your representative paradigm, I think we have to reevaluate its efficacy. It's to silence you, to make you feel good. Oh, I wrote a letter to my representative. Revisiting the independence of information sources. Is CPC an independent medium? I don't think so. I can prove that it is not. Is BBC an independent medium? Of course not, okay? They are mouthpieces of the government, which is really heavily corporate controlled. Who is sustaining and nourishing genocide? Allow me, please. Who is sustaining and nourishing genocide? Weapon traders with Israel, including US, Germany, France, UK. Those are trading with Israel. While Canada is trying to do something lately, I think he got the pressure, voting and all of that. But nevertheless, Canada did the right thing recently, just in the last week. But India is the biggest importer of Israeli weapons. Do you know that? Almost 3 billion in 1 decade. No wonder Modi was having wonderful time on the beaches north of Gaza with Netanyahu 2 years ago, right? They were like lovers. A hand in hand, really. I mean, it was too much, I thought. A case in point, when Europe enacted laws, this is important for us to consider, that would punish pedophilia crimes committed outside its borders. Why shouldn't we have something similar? If someone, you know, Europe will prosecute someone who goes to Thailand to have sex with minors, they enacted laws to prosecute them. I think we should generalize this, actually. So these are concrete things that I am recommending. The role of NGOs and charitable institutions in sustaining and nourishing and helping the Israeli and other genocidal enterprises. You know, the largest beneficiary, okay, donee, they use that term, of Canadian charitable organizations, guess the largest beneficiary. Can someone guess? The Technion of Israel. I was shocked to learn this. Thanks to the invitation, because I did my homework to find this information today, I was really shocked. Okay, I have the figure. In fact, you know how much they give. I can share it with you later on. And finally, I'm almost there. Just 1 second. Okay. And we need to separate between nations that commit genocide versus nations that have a value system different from ours. Otherwise, really, we are falling into this superiority, inferiority, dangerous pathway, okay? So, and finally, role of academic institutions. We do have a code of ethics. Please let me share this with you. We do have a code of ethics for students and faculty, right? I can talk about faculty. We do have a code of ethics. Wow, that's great. And we should, right? We have code of ethics for professional engineers. In my world, engineering, we have a code of ethics. But do we have code of ethics for universities in as far as their collaboration with other universities? I think we should establish that. So with these concrete points, I will stop. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you to the professor. And our last speaker for today is our Prabhjot Singh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Can you hear me in the back? Coming through? So firstly, I just want to thank the organizers for organizing this event, and to Professors Pukan and Ramahi for sharing their stories, that struggle, that perspective. Because I think the purpose of this space, like Professor Pukan, like you had said, is bringing our minds and our hearts together. Is creating a space where we're not just speaking past each other and talking about words, speaking at each other, but where we're actually coming to a common space, trying to find that common ground and understanding. How these struggles are interwoven, and not just in terms of the reaction of the massacres and the violence perpetrated on our communities, but also in our agency. And like when Professor Pukan is centering the story around water defenders, centering the stories around water as being the source of life, is confronting the politics of genocide isn't just about a reaction, isn't just about victimhood, but it's about asserting the will for life. And I think Professor Ramahi, when you started that, you're not gonna start and rattle off statistics about the number of people killed, the way that children are being targeted in Gaza. I think in a lot of these situations and a lot of these cases, we focus on the spectacle of violence. So I think from kind of my perspective, the Sikh community's perspective, I think for people within the community and without, is the assassination of Shaheed Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar in June of last year. It became this flashpoint where people started to think and be like, oh, like there's something happening here. That this foreign government came and assassinated a Sikh living in Canada. When people are talking about these mediatized narratives of Palestine and censoring these stories, there's a spectacle of violence that's conjured on October 7th. There's a mediatized narrative that's created, and everything that follows is in the context of that, in that time-bound space of the narrative that's created. Rather than the historical context, not just focusing on the flashpoints, but understanding the churning that's happening underneath the surface of how these moments of violence, of conflict, of resistance come to the surface. So I know we only have 20 minutes, and for me, like, I'd really like to save as much time as possible for the Q&A. So I'll try not to ramble for too long. So if somebody could just give me a signal kind of when I have about 5 minutes left, and I'll try to wrap up. But I think one of the commonalities between all three of us and kind of the stories we've told is this idea of colonialism. The impact, the role, the history, the context of colonialism. When you look at Turtle Island, the space that we're occupying here today as settlers, a lot of us, myself, when we look at the story of Palestine, you look at the story of settler colonialism and understanding what that political structure looks like. When we're looking at Punjab, a lot of times we don't look at this as a problem of colonialism. We erase that context altogether And the struggle, the conflict starts in 1947, after India was supposedly decolonized. So I want to start on this idea that invasion is a structure, not an event. So when we look at the Sikh conflict with India, it didn't just start in 1947. We have to go to the roots of 1849 and understand how the Farangi, the colonizer, came to Punjab, overturned the sovereign Sikh political structure, the social structure of that time, and colonized Punjab. What happened to the economy? What happened to social relationships? What happened to the philosophies and worldviews? What happened to the political structure? Because that's the moment in time that the current structure, that when we talk about the BJP, when we talk about India, those roots come in 1849. So when we're looking at that structure, not the event, that structure of genocide starts immediately in 1849. General Dalhousie, who was the Governor General of what became the British colonial state, around this period very explicitly states that unless and until we obliterate Sikh political power in this region, we will never have a stranglehold on South Asia. That the British colony, the British Empire, will constantly be at risk. So when we're looking at genocide, when we're looking at this structure, there's first this moment of genocide, of killing those who continue to resist, those who continue to assert sovereignty. Jinnah ne Padshahi dawa qaim rakha, those who asserted their sovereignty as Sikhs on our own terms, targeted for death and elimination. And those who survived were then internalized and subjugated to a system that they challenged in the first place. So if you look at the example of Bhai Maharaj Singh, Bhai Maharaj Singh led one of the first rebellions against the British right after 1849. He contested the legitimacy of the British colonial power, of British sovereignty. Regardless, Bhai Maharaj Singh was inducted into the colonial system as a criminal. So even when the sovereignty is contested, there's still mechanisms, this administrative structure of colonialism that brings people into the fold. When we look at it in our context here, when we talk about incarceration rates of the original peoples of this land, of indigenous communities, we talk about the disproportionate incarceration of indigenous peoples. When we look at this land as a colonized place, what is the proportion that we're okay with of indigenous people who are locked in cages of colonial powers? So along with the structure of genocide, this administrative structure, the political structures that are established, the judicial structures that are established, and the schools. The residential schools that we see as a legacy and the direct execution of genocide in Canada is something that was consistently used across the British Empire. So even when we look at South Asia, I forget his first name, but there was a British administrator who wrote this book called Macaulay's Minute, when he talks about education, and it pretty much echoes the same thing. John A. Macdonald says something to the effect of, kill the Indian, save the man. Macaulay's Minute says the exact same thing about setting up an educational system in South Asia. And there's a lot of focus on understanding what Punjab's educational structure was and how to completely dismantle it and replace it to create a new sensibility and a new sense of life and a new sense of the world. And so just for a quick example, when you look at the concept of land, when you look at the concept of land within Sikh spirituality, there is this sense of the land is the mother. Land is the mother. There's an ethical, a spiritual relationship with the land. When you implement colonialism, the mapping that's done of the land, the surveying of the land that's done, the records that get created of the land becomes a commodity. Land becomes something that you buy and sell to create and generate wealth. That relationship as mother is no longer there anymore. So it's understanding that the impacts of colonialism aren't just about targeting bodies for death, or occupying land. And genocide isn't just about targeting and eliminating bodies. It's about making it impossible for a way of life and a people to survive, and finding ways to save the body and the material that will continue to generate wealth that can be exploited by eliminating all of the challenges in the processes. So when you look at 1947 and the foundation of the current Indian state, it wasn't decolonization. There was no liberation for the South Asian subcontinent. India as a structure and as an entity has never existed in history. That entire region has had different political structures. The diversity in that entire region is so deep, it's sometimes difficult to imagine and understand. It wasn't one political and administrative structure. The British created this structure to facilitate imperialist exploitation. So in 1947, when the British leave, it's not decolonization, it's not liberation. It's called, and it's a legal document that was signed, that's called the transfer of power. That the British colonizers who created this structure, who exploited this entire region, who targeted peoples for genocide, signed a paper and handed over the keys to a group of elites that were pretty much educated in their schools, one specific ethnic group called the Savarna Hindu communities, or the upper castes. So it's not just this idea of passing over, this idea of India is transferred to quote unquote Hindus. It's this sense that there is the codification and categorization of the community, and one sliver that's essentially handed over the keys. So when you look at India's place within the world order, when we see India as especially within the Third World Project, as a third world country, or as a developing country, and then trying to locate the position of Sikhs and of Punjab, India is a subordinated part of the periphery in the world order. It's treated as a neo-colony. Punjab is the colony of the colony. Punjab's agrarian structure, the political structures, were all created and administered in such a way to serve the survival and the prosperity of India, so then that wealth could then be transferred to imperialist countries in the West. So just as a quick example, I think a lot of folks have heard about the farmers' protests that were between 2020 and 2021 and that are kind of ongoing until today. Justin Trudeau made statements during those protests, condemning human rights violations and asserting the right of protest. And a lot of people celebrated that moment. But what doesn't get talked about, that it was actually Canada that pushed India through the World Trade Organization to implement those reforms in the first place. So it's understanding this implication of imperialism and of colonialism didn't end at any point, and that it's an ongoing system and a process. So without getting into the complexities and the nitty-gritty of the history and kind of just rambling at you for a really long period of time, I'm happy we can answer, during the Q&A we can come back to some of this stuff. But after 1947 and even before that, Sikhs as a community engaged and imagined different creative ways to assert their dignity and assert their sovereignty in the region. And when it came to a certain point where the Indian state invaded Darbar Sahib, Professor Ramahi, you talked about, it's referred to as the Golden Temple. The name is Darbar Sahib. And for us, that it's a center of Miri Piri. It's the center of our spiritual center and our political sovereignty. When the Indian state invades Darbar Sahib in 1984 and creates this spectacle of violence that's happened after this 150 years of colonialism, it's after the genocide that's perpetrated in November in Delhi and across India, when the armed insurgency and the liberation struggle really takes off in Punjab. So when we talk about genocide, understanding and looking at identifying the patterns, they're consistent and common throughout different periods of time. If you look at our own context, 1849 and 1984 are pretty much names, dates, figures can be changed, but the process is the exact same. And I know for a lot of folks in the community watching the violence happening in Gaza right now, the way that the discourse, the mediatization, the censorship, the manufacturing of a narrative to justify violence and then blame the community for it by demonizing resistance in and of itself, that this is their own fault, is something that happens perfectly like an orchestra out of this playbook. So when you look at the 1980s and 1990s in Punjab, when you see the militarization of police and of that entire region, you had pretty much Punjab police's kind of strength and numbers triple over a period of 10 to 15 years. Where before this period, there's about 25,000 cops within Punjab. By the early 90s, there's 75,000. It's the highest concentration of police, and we're not talking about paramilitary in the army yet. We're just talking about police, to the point where the state that was second was less than half in terms of kind of per capita, per region kind of deal. You're talking about 100 to 150,000 paramilitary troops that get pretty much stationed within Punjab. And then you have the army on top of that. You have civil society being attacked in terms of journalists, in terms of political activists, in terms of human rights activists who are going to document and report on the atrocities. Same thing we're seeing in Gaza in the last little bit, is the intentional targeting of journalists so that nobody survives to be able to tell the story. And then the complete targeting of a community, regardless of whether somebody's a guerrilla and a combatant, whether they're a political activist, whether it's a family member, whether it's a sympathizer, whether it's somebody who looks like them, completely eliminated. So now, like, when we, and fast forwarding just for time's sake, is when we fast forward now to Bhai Hardeep Singh's shahadat, his martyrdom, the assassination that we saw last year. Canada's complicity throughout this entire process isn't something that was just recent. It wasn't just their way that they muddled the assassination threat, but it's the fact that even in the 1980s, Canada was aware that Indian intelligence operatives were active in Canada, were intimidating families, were collecting data to target families back in Punjab, that were infiltrating community spaces, that were trying to pretty much control and stoke conflict within the community. During that period, when it was very clear and apparent that India was committing genocide, Brian Mulroney passed away recently, and there's been a lot of conversation about his legacy. Brian Mulroney and his team were in India in November. There was firsthand accounts and witnessing of that violence. But that same administration, a couple of years later, signed an extradition treaty with India at the same time. There was complete silence and complicity at that period of time because of their geopolitical and economic interests, which were explicitly stated multiple times in the media at that time. So now, even when we look at today, the politics, the theatrics, and the pageantry around Bhai Hardeep Singh's assassination. The assassination happens on June 18th, and immediately the community was unequivocal and very, very clear that the assassination was orchestrated by the Indian state. Nobody paid attention until it was Justin Trudeau, a white Canadian politician standing in Parliament, acknowledging that fact. And that's when it becomes news. And it becomes news to the degree that's necessary and relevant or valuable for the Canadian administration and their interests in that region. So when you look at, if you go back to Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, the US Indo-Pacific strategy, the EU has an Indo-Pacific strategy, Australia has developed an Indo-Pacific strategy. There's a sense that the center of gravity in geopolitics, in terms of military power, in terms of economic power, has shifted to that region in South Asia. And if there's this conflict with China, there's a lot of this narrative that China needs to be countered. And if China needs to be countered and encircled, a lot of these Western powers are relying on India to be their outpost, the outpost of imperialism within that region, the same way, in the same role that Israel has pretty much executed and implemented within the Middle East. So you see this kind of tiptoeing and this dance of condemnation of India for orchestrating an assassination, And then at the same time, a few weeks ago, there's been very clear reports that the Canadian administration is offering PowerPoints to Indian security agencies on how to effectively build a case to harass, extradite, and surveil Canadian activists. That cooperation continues to go unhindered, regardless of the fact that what the government is saying, that a citizen was assassinated. So if understanding the kind of the role, the place of India within kind of Canadian geopolitical interests, where that places us, where that places our communities, and what the response is, and being able to see through the theatrics, which I think is the most important thing. And in terms of the conversation that we're having today, bringing our minds, our hearts together, occupying common space and common ground, is understanding that reliance on these states and hoping for, they have our best interests at heart, or they will be able to do something for us. I think shifting away from that mindset, building relationships from the grassroots, developing these centers of popular power, rather than consistently trying to kind of kowtow or appease to the oppressors or the colonizers' moral conscience, which I think as the three of us have spoken to at length over the past several hundred years, that moral conscience doesn't exist.
All right, can we have a big round of applause for our three speakers today? So now we'll have an open Q&A session where you guys can ask questions. We'll also put up a QR code where you can anonymously ask questions if you don't want to ask them for anyone else. Q&A period is now open, so who would like to ask a question? Right?
So in terms of Waterloo, you talked about Technion. Like Waterloo does have, I guess, financial relations with them. Is there a way that like students, educators, like the community as a whole can kind of hold the university complicit in terms of that?
That's an excellent question. That question relates to the Technion. The Technion, for those who don't know, is like quote unquote the MIT of Israel. So it's a university in Israel that has very, very strong ties to the Israeli military complex, industrial military complex. And the Israeli industrial military complex is a very sinister industry. So I think that these are amongst the action items that we can do to cut. You mentioned financial ties. I cannot attest to that, but I think there's academic understanding that they have some kind of agreement between the two universities. From my understanding, no one has joined this collaboration. I was approached by a professor there, and I simply wrote that professor a letter, very polite but very strong, saying that as long as there's occupation, I cannot in any way participate in this. But this is an item that I think the students can really focus on. I just want to mention one word. The students, please realize, you students have a lot of power. We faculty have very little power. Do you believe me or no? How many believe me? Raise your hand. So the rest don't believe me, right? You know why? Because those who pay have more power. Always. Right? Those who pay have more power. Exercise that power. I'll just take an opportunity. I have about 6 copies here of the Human Rights Council latest production, fresh off the press today. Anatomy of Genocide. It summarizes the horror that took place in Gaza over the last 5 months. I have 6 copies for anyone who wants to pick up, and for those who love the virtual copies or the PDF, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as well. So there's a total of 10, okay? You can pick them up if you like at the end. Sorry, I took more.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question, or should we open up with the anonymous? Yes.
I had a question for Professor Ramahi. So towards the end of your speech, you mentioned differentiating between countries that actively commit genocide and between countries whose values don't necessarily align with them. So my question with that was regarding, like, I just was hoping for you to expand on that, because my belief, like, as far as, like, what I think about it is that killing and destroying the people's culture, economy, and essentially their way of life is something that is universally visible and universally visible and should be.
Thank you so much. Thank you. When I wrote that, I knew that someone will raise that point. Thank you very much. So let me clarify. I meant social values. That's what I meant. Social values. The way we do things socially in Canada is not necessarily a universal way to behave socially. Right? I'm not going to say right or wrong. We collectively in Canada decide what's socially acceptable, right? But I cannot impose it. For instance, here's an example. You go to certain parts of Saudi Arabia. I lived in Saudi Arabia a long time ago. Women cover their entire face and they leave their eyes. It's the culture. I cannot go and tell them take it off, right? According to my religious belief as a Muslim, I believe that Islam doesn't call for the cover of the face or the hair, for that matter. But I don't have that superiority to go tell them take it off. That's what I meant. Thank you so much. But when it comes to the other values, killing, theft, right, genocide, that's a different matter altogether.
The question wasn't for me, but I just want to comment. When I was a student in public health, here right in Ontario, with lots of very wealthy Canadian students, most of them doctors and nurses, a part of our work was looking globally, looking at other countries. Global health is a huge part of it. And the students I was in this program with were very vocal about, and I'm not trying to hurt anyone, like, just gonna say it like it is. These students were very upset with what was happening in different countries in Africa around female genital mutilation. And they spoke at length about what was happening to women as a part of that culture. But when I said to my fellow Canadians, we have no problem performing male genital mutilation in our hospitals. We do it all, and years ago this was normal, it was standard, it happened to everybody without question. No, not once did we ever hold up the mirror and look at ourselves. And that's was something we talked about before we started speaking here today. Was that something that we can do as individuals is right, that pointing fingers, or you point at somebody, there's three pointing back at you. That same idea of looking at yourself and changing yourself in order to change the society around us. I mean, it's a weird way to think about it, changing yourself and it's going to change others, but it does. It does. And the more we're willing to point these things out about our own Canadian society, the more we can start addressing that, thinking we're the best and we're the smartest and our culture somehow, what we're building here is somehow better than anywhere else in the world is simply not true. Not true at all. But thanks for letting me say that.
This question is for Mr. Singh. So in terms of the Khalistan movement, are there ways that non-Sikh people can also, I guess, help spread the message, or what are ways that non-Sikh people can support?
I think it's similar to other movements in politics of resistance in other places as well. Is how do we get involved? Because I'm sure on campus as well, there's probably a lot of Sikh members as part of Voices for Palestine and other groups or other Indigenous organizations. And it's also kind of incumbent on our community as well and our organizations to create space on campus to openly, boldly have these conversations and not be kind of pushed away, to shy away from using the word Khalistan for actively speaking about liberation, because it's not a dirty word and it's not something to be afraid of. So kind of I think it's on both fronts, where our community and our kind of 6 students associations and other kind of campus and community organizations creating those spaces like we did today, like the Waterloo SSA did, creating the spaces to have those conversations, actively engaging ourselves, and for other communities to actively engage as well, and kind of going back and forth between each other's organizations, where it's not just this is your guys' event and that's it, and everyone's operating in a silo. But I think kind of campus and like, I still remember my life as an undergrad student and the amount of organizing we did, the amount of interaction, the amount of learning I did outside the classroom. I was one of those students in my undergrad, my philosophy was C's get degrees. My focus was on community organizing and campus organizing. And the amount of life experience I got, the amount that I learned about myself, about politics, about organizing, about struggle, was something that was unmatched. So I would say regardless, sick, non-sick, for kind of all students is actively engaging in that and prioritizing that as a part of this process. Not just coming here to kind of get your degree and make your money, which is important, but also using this opportunity to contribute in a larger way.
This question goes to the entire panel, but one thing I think is very interesting is why should people from either different faiths, different communities, or any other part of maybe think about it like that, why should they feel empathetic about what is going on for people who have other faith, culture, and other things like that happening either here or in other parts of the world?
Can I say something? You know, if I as a Palestinian raise this question, I go to Palestine, go to refugee camps, and I wish any one of you, if any one of you go to Palestine, please go to the refugee camps, please. Okay, don't go to Tel Aviv, Jaffa, and all of. Go to refugee camps because you'll see the Nakba right there in front of you. Okay. I've seen a lot in my life. Okay. If I ask this question, if I see a Jewish woman who is thirsty, Israeli, sorry, not Jewish. Jewish is not the right thing to say. An Israeli woman who is thirsty, will I prevent her from having water or not? You see, I will never do that. Impossible for me. I will give her water. So let's go back to the humanity that binds us, right? You are a human. I don't care if you're Sikh or not. I'm talking about myself. I evolved to the point where I visit a Sikh temple or a Hindu temple or a Christian church, and with a lot of respect. It took a while for me to realize the commonality. If I see someone being savagely killed amongst Sikhs, if I turn my eyes, if I move on, then why should anyone help me? When my people, I shouldn't put it in a crass capitalistic way. That's a capitalistic way, the way I put it. If I don't do that, nobody would do that to me. That's wrong, I'm sorry, okay? But we're humans, we have one destiny. Where's the humanity in us? It is not, if I care the least about the indigenous people of Canada, okay? By the way, I should say this. We in Canada here, we're the beneficiaries of the genocide that happened to the natives. We're the beneficiaries of that genocide. Otherwise, I will be back in the Middle East, right? And this prosperity is because of the genocide. You see? So it is one common destiny. This is an evolution that we have to go through ourselves, right? To have that feeling. And please, you want to contribute to it? I mean, the question was to the
I
panel.
do. I'm going to take a totally different way around it. I came talking about water, so I'll bring it back to water. One of our Anishinaabe teachings, and I think you hear it it's shared in Turtle Island, maybe with every Indigenous group. But one of our teachings is this coming to this understanding that we are all interrelated and we are all connected. And I've heard that my whole life, but it didn't really click in until I went out in the ocean and saw the plastic. That got me to think about, how do I convince my fellow Canadians to change our behavior here in order to help the First Nations everywhere in this infertile island? And it came down to talking about garbage and water. So many First Nations we know don't have access to clean water in Canada. We don't have infrastructure. Justin Trudeau's government is attempting to change that, and I guess they've made a little bit of room. But the point around the water is that many communities still don't have clean water, including my own. Only half of my reserve has clean water. The rest of us are drinking plastic water. Now, we don't have recycling facilities in our communities. We have landfills, but no recycling. Everything goes into the earth. So when I was out in the ocean, I'd ask the other scientists, where's all this plastic coming from? Is it coming off the boats? Well, they started saying no. Water moves in ways underneath the earth that we're really not sure of. And stuff moves around under there. So garbage and plastic bottles, any kind of plastic going into the landfills in our reserves, because we don't have access to clean water, eventually that gets into the ocean. Eventually that gets into the waterway and the soil. And so when you're at Starbucks getting your fancy salad and your special coffees, it's actually plastic in your vegetables and plastic in your water that you're drinking. So we can ignore Indigenous people all we want, but it's going to come back and bite you in the butt in the end, because we are all connected and we're all interrelated. We can look at studies of the water in Lake Huron. There is a ton of drugs and pharmaceuticals in that water. So when people are taking drugs, whether it's to help their body or to help ease their trauma in their minds, when it exits the body and goes through our water treatment centers, we don't filter that stuff out of the water. So all of this drugs that people are taking for diabetes, for birth control, I'm talking to young people, all of that stuff ends up in the lake. And then when we turn on our tap, we're drinking it. It's in our fish, it's in our vegetables, in the soil. So anything you put in your body is going to go into my body. And so that's another thing about changing, we talked about this, our own personal ethics and our personal values. Set your own parameters for your own behavior. Say no to plastic. I don't know what the options are, especially if our water's contaminated, but thank God you're all engineers and scientists and you're going to figure this out. Because we've made a really big stinking mess, and we need young people. We need your fresh ideas, your innovation, and we need to think outside the box about how we're going to fix this. So yeah, we don't really have to care, but in the end, it's going to come back on each and every single one of us. Thanks, I appreciate the question.
And I just want to build on something in terms of the interconnectedness. So I can answer from a Sikh perspective in terms of what informs my worldview and understanding. And I think like Professor Ramahi said, is like that very crass way of looking at solidarity. I think that's where that question comes from, is this capitalist kind of perspective of transactional solidarity, where a lot of times the question or the reason or the impetus for solidarity is we'll go help them and hopefully they'll come help us. Or if maybe in the most kind of altruistic way, we can say that we consider them a part of our own community, and maybe our community would go through that too, so we should help them. It's still coming kind of out of a self-interest. And so when we talk about the impacts of colonialism, like from a Sikh perspective, our concept of the world, this responsibility of Sarvata Dapala, the welfare of all, our sense of divinity, of the creator, of Akal Purkh, is not this sense that the creator is something separate from us. It's a sense of Sahasatavanan and Nananan Hetohiko. This idea that you have countless of eyes, but no one set of eyes belongs to you. Because the creator is immersed within all of the universe, within the entire creation. So for us, and if you look at our history, there's countless examples of this where Sikhs entered into battles and sacrificed themselves and attained shahada, martyrdom, in situations that had nothing to do with us and our interests. The drive for that, the reason for that is not political expediency, it's not out of self-interest, and it's not out of a transactional solidarity. It's out of a strong sense of justice that if oppression or injustice occurs against anybody, anything, any part of creation, whether that's the water, whether that's the land, whether that's the air, whether that's people, that's a desecration and a disrespect of our Creator. And we have a responsibility to react against that. And that's been the driving force of our entire history. So I think really kind of letting that sink in and internalize. It's not this sense of we're going to help them or we're not going to help them or show up because they don't show up to our stuff. Because that's never been how we've made decisions.
I just want to make a quick word, is that I love what you said. Thank you, both of you. Thank you so much. You know, I live by the following motto, by the following philosophy: doing the right thing and let things happen. Whatever happens, let it happen. Just doing the right thing. I want to comment quickly on I've been, you know, the genocide in Gaza had awakened us or reawakened or made us see other dimensions that we never saw before. I'm talking about myself. Here I am claiming that old enough to know many things, but it turns out that there's still a lot to know, and even about my own culture, my own world. I thought I knew all of that. It made me reflect, okay? When I saw South Africans defending the cause of Palestinians, it moved me. I mean, the Arabs are doing nothing because they're under strong colonization. They're still being colonized, the Arab countries, severely. I'm not saying this lightly, you know. India, I believe that I've been thinking about this because I just came back from a trip to India. Just share a 1-minute story. I was in a hotel, one of those nice bungalow hotels in South Delhi, you know, a hip part of Delhi. And I saw when the Queen visited Delhi in 1953, the huge reception, people lining on the streets to welcome her in Connaught Place. I said, wait a minute, was India decolonized? I mean, how would you greet your colonizer only 3 or 4 years after you get your independence? Did the Algerians do that? The Algerians didn't do that. That made me really think, was India decolonized or not? The Arab world has yet to reach that stage, even if it's partial decolonization. Okay, so my point is that we need, in this world of Amazon, the gratification, the you know, everything in this today's world, for those who lived enough, they can tell the difference. For young people, they may not. Everything is becoming entertainment in our world. Transportation become entertainment. You need a Porsche, you know, a Corolla is not sufficient for mass transportation. Food is becoming entertainment. Information is becoming entertainment. We're really living in a dangerous world. Watch out, guys. Young people, I'm really afraid for you unless you really work very hard to realize what's happening around us. We need a cultural reawakening. And I should say that it cannot be complete without a philosophy, economic philosophy. Impossible to separate the two. Impossible. Okay? So remember that. I'll stop here. Otherwise, you know, we professors can go on and on. We're paid to talk, right? So we have to be stopped, right?
All right. Sorry we couldn't have a longer Q&A period, but that is the end of today's event. So can I have a big round of applause for our next speakers? Some of the speakers may still be around if you have any questions for them individually, but for now, that is the end of the event. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our speakers for coming out as well. And goodbye, I guess.